picture a street in Los Angeles in the early 1950s. The sun is white and flat and merciless, the way it gets in late summer when the whole city smells like hot asphalt and orange blossoms. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. A man walks out of a studio gate on that street. He's carrying a cardboard box. Inside the box are a few framed photos, a coffee mug, a script he never got to finish. He doesn't look back at the gate. He already knows it won't open for him again. Nobody stopped him. Nobody arrested him. Nobody put a hand on his shoulder. He just stopped existing as far as Hollywood was concerned. His name was gone from the credits. His phone stopped ringing. His friends stopped calling. And the strange part, the part that stays with you, is that almost nobody talked about it out loud. That's where this story begins. Hollywood has always been two things at once. On the surface, it's a dream factory, a place where ordinary people from small towns and hard lives came to make something beautiful out of light and shadow. They built whole worlds on backlots. They made you cry over people who never existed. They made you believe in love and courage and the goodness of strangers. That was the product. That was what they sold. But underneath that, there was always something else. A current of anxiety running just below the bright surface, cold as a river under ice. Hollywood was a company town, and company towns have rules. You followed the rules, or you found out what happened to people who didn't. In the late 1940s and into the 1950s, those rules changed. They got tighter. They got stranger. And the people enforcing them weren't just studio bosses in expensive suits. Some of them worked for the government. Some of them, if the documents that came out decades later are to be believed, worked for an agency that wasn't supposed to be in the business of making movies at all. The story you're about to hear is about power, about who gets to decide what stories a country tells itself, about what happens when the people in charge of those decisions decide that art is too dangerous to leave to artists. It's about the Hollywood Blacklist. Most people have heard the name. Some people know the broad shape of it, the hearings, the lists, the careers destroyed, the names that disappeared from screens and credits and conversations. It's one of those chapters of American history that gets taught in school and then quietly set aside, filed under things that happened once and won't happen again. But the full shape of it is stranger than the textbook version, and the questions it leaves behind are the kind that don't have clean answers. Who was really running the blacklist? What they were actually afraid of? And whether the goal was ever really about spies at all, or whether it was always about something simpler and more permanent: control over the stories, control over the dreams. Those angels in that era had a particular quality of light that painters and photographers have tried to capture ever since. It came in low and golden in the mornings, cutting long shadows across the wide, flat streets. The palm trees stood tall and still against a sky so blue it looked painted. The hills above the city were dry and brown and dotted with scrub brush. And at night, the lights of the valley spread out below them like scattered sparks. It was a beautiful place. And inside that beauty, something was rotting quietly. People were watching each other. Neighbors reported neighbors. Friends informed on friends. Writers sat at their typewriters and wondered if the words they put on the page would be used against them someday. Directors made choices about what stories to tell and what stories to leave alone. And some of those choices weren't really choices at all. The fear was in the air, the way smoke is in the air after a fire. You couldn't see it, but you could smell it. And once you smelled it, you couldn't stop noticing it everywhere you went. This is the story of how that happened. How a town built on imagination became a place where imagination had a price, and how the people who paid that price carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Settle in. The night is long, and this story has more layers than it first appears. To understand what happened, you have to understand what Hollywood was before it had anything to fear. Go back past the hearings and the lists and the names read aloud in cold government rooms. Go back to the years just before all of that. The late 1930s, the early 1940s, a time when the air in Los Angeles smelled like orange blossoms and car exhaust, and something else, something harder to name. promise, maybe. The particular smell of a place that believes in itself completely. The city was young then. Not young the way a child is young, but young the way a new idea is young. Still forming, still deciding what it wanted to be. The streets of Hollywood were wide and sun-bleached, lined with palm trees that stood tall and a little ridiculous against that famous blue sky. The sidewalks were warm underfoot even in December. The light came down hard and flat and golden. The kind of light that makes everything look slightly more real than it actually is. The studios sat behind their walls like small cities inside the city. Warner Bros. In Burbank, MGM in Culver City, Paramount right there on Melrose, its famous arch gate standing at the entrance like the door to another world. Inside those gates, entire universes were built and torn down in a matter of weeks. Roman colosseums, frontier towns, Parisian streets, the carpenters and painters and set dressers arrived before dawn and worked until the light failed, and the smell of fresh sawdust and wet paint drifted through the lots like a kind of perfume. The men and women who wrote the movies lived in the hills and the canyons and the flat grids of streets below. They drove to work in wide, rounded cars the color of cream and forest green and deep burgundy. They wore suits and hats even in the heat. The women wore dresses with padded shoulders and shoes with small heels that clicked on the studio floors. Everyone smoked. Cigarettes in long holders, cigarettes tucked behind ears, cigarettes burning in glass ashtrays on every desk, in every office from Culver City to Burbank. The writers were the ones who mattered most to what came next. Not the stars, though the stars got all the attention. The writers were the ones who decided what stories got told. They sat in small offices with frosted glass windows and manual typewriters that clattered like distant applause. They drank coffee from ceramic mugs and argued about politics and literature and the state of the world. Because in those years, the state of the world was impossible to ignore. Europe was burning. The Depression had only just loosened its grip. Workers across America were organizing, demanding better wages, better conditions, some basic dignity. Ideas were moving through the culture the way weather moves through a valley, fast and low and hard to stop. Communism was one of those ideas. So was socialism. So was the simple belief that the people who made things deserved a fair share of what those things were worth. Hollywood was full of people who held those beliefs. Writers, directors, actors, composers. Some of them had joined the Communist Party in the 1930s, when the party was one of the few organized voices speaking out against fascism in Europe and poverty at home. Some had attended meetings. Some had signed petitions. Some had simply read the wrong books or been friends with the wrong people at the wrong dinner parties. None of this was secret exactly. It was just life, the life of people who thought hard about the world and talked openly about what they thought. The coffee shops along Hollywood Boulevard were full of those conversations. The dinner tables in the canyon houses were full of them. People argued and debated and changed their minds and argued again. The way people do when they believe that ideas matter, and that the right idea, spoken clearly enough, might actually change something. They were not wrong that ideas mattered. That was the one thing they and their enemies agreed on completely. Because somewhere else, in rooms far from the warm California light, other people were paying very close attention. Men in Washington, men in suits that were darker and heavier than the ones worn in Hollywood. Men who read reports and kept files and believed with a certainty that bordered on religious that the stories America told about itself were not just entertainment. They were something more powerful than that, something that needed to be managed, controlled, pointed in the right direction. Those men were watching. They had been watching for a while, and soon enough, the people in the canyon houses and the frosted glass offices would feel that watching like a hand on the back of the neck. But not yet, for now the typewriters clattered, the cigarettes burned, the light came down gold and hard and beautiful, and nobody knew yet what was coming. Picture the men in Washington the way they actually were. Not as shadows, not as symbols, as people who woke up in the morning, drank their coffee, and went to work in buildings made of white stone and gray marble, where the hallways smelled of old paper and floor wax, and something faintly metallic, like a key that had been held too long in a closed fist. One of those men was J. Edgar Hoover. You already know the name, but strip away what you know for a moment and just look at him. Short, broad through the shoulders, a face like a clenched jaw, heavy-browed and watchful, with small dark eyes that moved around a room the way a man's eyes move when he has learned, over many years, never to trust what is directly in front of him. He wore his suits pressed so hard the creases looked like they could cut. He kept files on everyone. That was not a rumor. That was his method, his religion, his art form. He believed that information was power, and that power was safety. And he had been building that safety for himself since 1924, when he first took over the Bureau and began turning it into something that answered, more than anything else, to him. Hoover looked at Hollywood the way a man looks at a fire he didn't start, with suspicion, with a kind of proprietary anger. He had been watching the film industry since the 1930s, when writers and directors and actors began showing up at meetings, in living rooms, in Lowe's Fellas and Silver Lake, drinking cheap wine and talking about labor and wages and the rights of working people. He had men at those meetings. He had informants in the studios. He had reports stacked in manila folders in rooms in Washington. And those reports had names in them, hundreds of names. And beside each name, a notation, a category, a level of concern. Then there was Senator Joseph McCarthy. He came from Wisconsin, from a small town where the winters were long and white, and the ground froze solid for months at a time. He was loud in a way that Hoover was not. Hoover was quiet and precise, like a man who sets a trap carefully and then waits. McCarthy was the opposite. He was blunt and blunt and blunt again. A man who had figured out that accusation itself was a kind of power, that you didn't need proof if you had volume, if you had a microphone, if you had a room full of reporters who needed a story by morning. He held up papers and said they contained names. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they were blank. It almost didn't matter. The gesture was the point. But the men who would shape what happened to Hollywood most directly were quieter than either of them. They worked in a building in Langley, Virginia, in offices with no names on the doors, in a place that had only officially existed since 1947. The Central Intelligence Agency was new then. It was still finding its shape, still deciding what it was and what it was willing to do. And some of the men inside, it had a particular interest in culture, in art, in the stories that moved through a population like water through soil, slow and invisible, and changing everything they touched. One of those men was Frank Wisner. He ran something called the Office of Policy Coordination, which was a careful, colorless name for a thing that was neither careful nor colorless. Wisner was from Mississippi, educated, charming in the way that certain Southern men are charming, with a warmth that felt genuine right up, until the moment you realized it was also a tool. He believed that the Cold War would be won or lost not on battlefields, but in minds. In the stories people told themselves about freedom, about America, about what the good life looked like and who deserved it. He called his network of cultural influence a mighty Wurlitzer, like the organ, like something that could fill a room with sound and make you feel things you couldn't quite name or trace back to their source. These were the men who looked west. Hoover with his files, McCarthy with his microphone, Wisner with his organ, and his quiet rooms, and his belief that a film seen by 20 million people on a Saturday night was a more powerful weapon than anything made of steel. They looked at Hollywood and they saw something that needed to be played, like an instrument, like a long, bright, beautiful instrument that had been sitting there, waiting, making its own music for years without anyone's permission. That was about to change. Picture a Tuesday morning in Hollywood. The year is 1947. The Santa Ana winds have gone quiet for once, and the air smells like jasmine and warm asphalt. The sky is that particular shade of blue you only get in Southern California, pale at the edges, deep as a swimming pool at the center. The palm trees stand perfectly still along Sunset Boulevard, their fronds hanging loose and lazy in the morning heat. The studios are already awake. They never really sleep. At MGM, the lot covers 175 acres in Culver City. It has its own police force, its own fire department, its own hospital. It has a barber shop and a dentist and a school for child actors. It has a street that looks like New York and a street that looks like a small American town and a lake just big enough to sink a ship on camera. It is a city inside a city, and it runs on a schedule as tight and precise as a railroad. The writers arrive early. They come in through the gates on Washington Boulevard, past the guard in his booth, past the rows of low white buildings with their flat roofs and their narrow windows. They carry coffee in paper cups. Some of them carry manuscripts. They wear sport coats and soft shoes, and the slightly distracted look of people whose minds are always half somewhere else, living inside a story that doesn't exist yet. They sit down at their desks by 9. They write until lunch. They eat in the commissary, where the food is decent and the gossip is better. They argue about dialogue and structure and whether a certain scene is working. They are, in most visible ways, ordinary people doing ordinary work. But the work was not ordinary, not even close. A single film in 1947 might reach 30 million people. Think about that number for a moment. 30 million people sitting in the dark, all at the same time, watching the same faces, hearing the same words, feeling the same things. Radio could reach people too, but radio was sound. Film was a dream. Film put pictures in your head that stayed there. Film told you what love looked like, and what courage looked like, and what the enemy looked like, and what America looked like when it was at its best. The men who wrote those films had enormous power. Most of them didn't think of it that way. They thought of themselves as craftsmen, storytellers, people who were good at their jobs and lucky enough to get paid for it. They showed up. They wrote. They went home. Some of them had politics. Of course they did. It was the 1940s. The whole world had politics. Some of them had been young men during the Depression, watching bread lines stretch around city blocks, watching families lose everything they had built. Some of them had looked at what was happening in Europe and felt something cold move through them. Some of them had joined the Communist Party, or attended meetings, or signed petitions, or simply believed that the working man deserved a better deal than he was getting. put some of that into their work. Not always loudly. Sometimes it was just a line of dialogue. A small moment where a poor character was treated with dignity. A rich character who turned out to be wrong. A story where the little guy won. These were not radical acts. They felt, to the people writing them, like simple honesty. Like telling the truth about the country they lived in. Meanwhile, in Washington, men in suits sat in offices with good furniture and bad lighting and read reports about what Hollywood was putting into the American mind. They had names for it. Subversive content, infiltration, the slow corruption of national values. They used words like that the way a doctor uses a diagnosis to make something feel clinical and certain, when the truth is more complicated and harder to pin down. Louis B. Mayer ran MGM like a king runs a small country with absolute authority and a very long memory. Jack Warner ran Warner Bros. The same way. These men had built their studios from nothing, from sheer will and appetite, and a belief that people would always pay to see a good story. They were not soft men. They were not easily frightened. But Washington was calling. And Washington had a way of making even powerful men feel like they were standing in a principal's office, waiting to be told what they had done wrong. The writers kept writing. The cameras kept rolling. The jasmine kept blooming along the studio walls. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. And underneath all of it, something was beginning to shift. It started the way these things always start. Not with a bang. Not with a speech or a vote or a man standing up and saying something has to change. It started with a name written on a piece of paper. Someone knew someone. Someone had heard something. Someone had been at a meeting years ago in a small apartment in Los Angeles where people sat on folding chairs and talked about workers and wages and the way the world ought to be. That was enough. The name went down. The paper got filed. And the file found its way into a folder. And the folder found its way into a drawer. And the drawer was in an office in Washington where the lights were always a little too dim. And the air always smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and old carpet. This is how a rumor becomes a list. Slowly, quietly, one name at a time. The year was 1947. The place was Washington, D.C., and the room was a hearing room in the House of Representatives, long and formal, with high ceilings and wooden chairs, and the kind of light that makes everyone look a little pale. The House Un-American Activities Committee had been around since 1938. But in 1947, it found its purpose. It turned its eyes west. It turned them toward the hills and the studios and the long, flat streets of Los Angeles, where the palm trees stood like sentinels in the dry, golden air, and the cameras never stopped rolling. The committee had a theory. The theory was this: the men and women who wrote the movies, who shaped the stories, who put words in the mouths of heroes and villains. Some of them had dangerous ideas. Some of them had been members of the Communist Party, or had attended meetings, or had friends who had. And if dangerous ideas could travel through people, they could travel through stories. And if they could travel through stories, they could travel through screens. And if they could travel through screens, they could travel into the minds of ordinary Americans sitting in the dark, eating popcorn, watching the light flicker on the wall. That was the theory. It sounds almost gentle when you say it out loud, almost reasonable. A worry about ideas spreading like seeds on the wind. But a theory needs evidence. And evidence, in this case, meant names. The committee began to ask questions. Quietly at first. Letters sent. Meetings requested. Men in suits showing up at studio gates with briefcases, and polite smiles and questions that didn't feel polite at all once you heard them. Have you ever attended a meeting of the Communist Party? Do you know this person? What about this one? The names came out one by one, like cards laid face up on a table. Some people answered. Some people answered very eagerly, in fact. They sat in those wooden chairs, and they spoke clearly into the microphone, and they gave names. Old friends, former colleagues, people they had known at parties, at meetings, at late-night dinners, where someone had said something that could be remembered a certain way if you chose to remember it that way. And the list grew. In Hollywood, the feeling was hard to name at first. It was something like a change in the weather. The way the air gets heavy before a storm, when the sky is still blue, but something in your body knows. writers noticed it first, the way writers tend to notice things. A phone call that didn't come. A lunch invitation that was quietly not extended. A producer who had always been warm and now seemed to be looking just past your shoulder when he talked to you, as if he was calculating something. The jasmine still bloomed along the studio walls. The cameras still rolled. The commissaries still smelled of coffee and fried eggs in the morning, and the sound stages still hummed with the low electric buzz of 100 lights burning at once. Everything looked exactly the same, but the names were being written down. And somewhere in a city 3,000 miles away, a drawer was getting full. Nobody announced it. Nobody stood up in a meeting and said that something had changed. That is not how these things work. The shift was quiet. It was the kind of shift you only understand later, when you are looking back and trying to find the moment when the ground moved under your feet. The list had no official name yet. It had no face. It was just paper and ink and the weight of someone's handwriting pressing down through the page. But it was real, and it was growing. And somewhere in Los Angeles, in a bungalow or a studio office or a house in the hills, someone whose name was already on it just didn't know it yet. Word got around the way it always does in a small town. And Hollywood, for all its size and noise, was a small town. It had its diners where the same people ate breakfast every morning. It had its barber shops where men talked too freely. It had its back lots where the grips and the gaffers and the prop men passed cigarettes and whispered things they wouldn't say on the record. These were the people who knew everything, not the stars, not the directors, the people who carried the cables and swept the floors and drove the cars. They always know first. And what they were saying in the fall of 1947 was that something had gone wrong. You have to picture the way a studio lot felt in those days. It was its own little city. There were streets with names. There were restaurants and barber shops and tailors right there on the grounds. There were people who had worked the same lot for 20 years and knew every corner of it the way you know your own house in the dark. They knew which sound state had the bad echo. They knew which producer liked his coffee black and which one liked it with 2 sugars. They They knew the rhythms of the place, the way a farmer knows the rhythms of his land. And when the rhythm changed, they felt it. A set dresser named Benny, who had worked at one of the big studios since the silent era, told his daughter years later that the first sign was the quiet. Not silence, exactly. The lot was never silent, but a certain kind of conversation stopped. The easy, loose talk that happens between setups, between shots, between scenes. People still talked, but they chose their words. They laughed a little less. They watched the door a little more. His daughter remembered him saying it felt like the air before a storm. Heavy, still, like the birds had stopped singing, and you didn't notice until you were already listening for them. An older woman who had worked in the costume department for years told a similar story to her neighbors on the east side of Los Angeles. She said she noticed it first in the lunch line. People who used to eat together started eating apart, not because they were angry, because they were careful, because they had heard that names were being written down, and they didn't know whose name was next to whose. She said it reminded her of something her mother had told her about growing up in a small town in the South, where certain people stopped being seen in public together after a particular summer. Not because anything had been said out loud, but because everyone understood that being seen together was now a kind of statement. And statements had consequences. That comparison moved through the community like a slow current. People recognized something in it. The older ones especially, the ones who had come from somewhere else, who had left somewhere else because of something like this. They had seen this before, not in Hollywood, not in America, but somewhere, in some other language, in some other decade. The feeling was familiar. A screenwriter who had been in the business since the early 30s described it to a friend as the moment when the room becomes a courtroom. Nobody says it. Nobody calls it that. But suddenly, everyone is aware that they are being watched and measured, and that their words are evidence. The jokes stop. The arguments stop. The long, rambling conversations about politics and art, and what America should be, and what it should become. Those conversations that used to fill the back booths of the restaurants on Cayuga and the bungalows on the Paramount lot. those conversations went quiet. And when those conversations went quiet, something else went quiet too. Something harder to name. A director's assistant, a young woman who had come out from Ohio with a suitcase and a head full of ideas, wrote in a letter to her mother that the studio felt like a church, where someone had just announced that God was listening more carefully than usual. Everyone was still going through the motions. The cameras still rolled. The lights still burned. The actors still hit their marks and said their lines, and the clapper boards still snapped shut at the start of every take. But the stories being told were already starting to change. Not all at once, not obviously, but the edges were being trimmed. The sharp corners were being rounded off. The questions that used to find their way into scripts, the uncomfortable ones, the ones that made you shift in your seat, those questions were getting quieter. And the people who asked them were getting nervous. The people who asked them were about to get a lot more than nervous. In October of 1947, 10 men sat down in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee in Washington, D.C., and refused to answer the question. The question was simple. Are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party? 10 men said no, not in the way you might expect. They didn't say no quietly. They didn't bow their heads and cooperate and go home. They stood up and said that the question itself was wrong, that the asking of it was a violation of something older and more important than any committee in any hearing room in any city in the country. Their names were Alva Bessie, Herbert by Berman, Lester Cole, Edward D. Mitrick, Ring Lardner Jr., John Howard Lawson, Albert Maltz, Samuel Ornitz, Adrian Scott, and Dalton Trumbo. Writers, mostly. A director or two. Men who had come to Hollywood the same way everyone else had, with a head full of stories and a belief that the movies could mean something. They became known as the Hollywood 10, and what happened to them is the kind of story that gets passed down in whispers, the kind that people in the industry told their children and their children's children, not as a warning exactly, but as a reminder of what this town was capable of when the fear got deep enough. Each of them was cited for contempt of Congress. Each of them was blacklisted, Each of them went to federal prison, not for doing anything, not for writing anything dangerous, or building anything, or hurting anyone, for refusing to answer a question that they believed no government had the right to ask. Now here is where the history gets older than 1947. The idea that a government could decide which thoughts were acceptable, which beliefs were safe, which conversations were permitted. That idea did not start with a committee room in Washington. It started much further back. It started in the soil of this country, in the earliest years of the colonies, when the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay decided that certain ideas were a threat to the community, and certain people who held those ideas needed to be removed. Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts in 1636 for suggesting that the government had no business telling people what to believe. He walked into the winter woods with almost nothing and founded what would become Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson was tried and expelled for holding prayer meetings in her home and saying things the magistrates didn't like. She walked out into the cold too. The pattern is old, older than the country itself. The Salem witch trials of 1692 are the version most people know. 19 people hanged, 1 pressed to death under stones, more than 100 jailed, all of it driven by accusation, by the pointing of fingers, by the terrible social machinery that gets set in motion when fear decides it needs a target. Arthur Miller, one of the writers who would later be called before the same committee that swallowed the Hollywood 10, wrote a play about Salem in 1953. He called it The Crucible. Everyone understood what he was really writing about. The machinery was the same. The names changed. The century changed. The fear found new clothes to wear. But the shape of it, the way it moved through a community, the way it turned neighbors into accusers and silence into survival, that shape was identical. The Hollywood 10 understood this. Some of them said so directly. Dalton Trumbo, who was perhaps the sharpest writer of the group, a man who could make words do almost anything he wanted, said that what was happening in those hearing rooms was not an investigation. It was a ceremony, a ritual. The point was not to find out the truth. The point was to make people perform their loyalty in public, to make them kneel, and to punish the ones who wouldn't. He went to prison for 11 months. When he came out, he kept writing. He wrote under other names, which is its own kind of story, and one that belongs a little later in this one. But the 10 men who sat in those chairs in October of 1947 and refused to perform, they did something that the country's oldest and deepest history had rarely seen. They looked at the machinery and said they could see what it was. The machinery did not stop. It rarely does, but it noticed them, and it made sure that everyone else in that town noticed them too. The cameras were still rolling. The lights were still burning. But the lesson had been delivered, clean and cold as a stone dropped into still water. Now think about the ones who did perform. Think about the ones who sat in those same chairs, under those same hot lights, and said, yes. Yes, I know these people. Yes, I can give you names. Yes, I will tell you everything you want to hear. They were called the friendly witnesses. That was the official term, friendly, as if this were a dinner party, as if the whole thing were a matter of good manners. Some of them were scared. That much is fair to say. Fear does strange things to a person. It bends them in directions they never expected to bend. A man can spend 20 years believing one thing about himself, and then sit down in a government hearing room and discover he was wrong the whole time. Fear is a very old teacher. It has been teaching people about themselves since the first fire went out in the first cave. But some of them were not scared at all. Some of them walked into those rooms with something close to eagerness. And that is the part worth looking at more carefully. What did the friendly witnesses get in return? The most obvious answer is that they kept working. In a town where a single phone call could end a career, where a name on a list meant the studio gates closed and stayed closed, the friendly witnesses found that the gates stayed open for them. Their phones kept ringing. Their contracts held. The checks arrived on time. In a place built on money and light, that was not a small thing. That was everything. Gary Cooper testified. Robert Taylor testified. Ronald Reagan, who was then the president of the Screen Actors Guild, testified and gave names, and later said he had done it to protect the industry. Walt Disney testified and named men he believed were communists, and said that certain strikes at his studio had been communist organized. These were not small names. These were the biggest names in the room, and when they walked out of those hearings, they walked out into the sunshine, into waiting cars, into a world that was still entirely theirs. Elia Kazan named names in 1952. He was one of the best directors alive. He had made films that cut right down to the bone of American life. He knew exactly what he was doing. He said later that he did it because he believed communism was a genuine danger. Maybe he did believe that, but he also kept working. He made some of his finest films after he testified. The ones he named did not work again for years. Some of them never worked again at all. There is a researcher, a woman who spent the better part of a decade going through the committee's records after they were finally made available. And she noticed something that had been sitting in the files all along. The friendly witnesses were not just protected. In several cases, they were actively promoted. Films they were attached to moved faster through the studio system. Projects that had been stalled for months suddenly found funding. It was not written down anywhere as a transaction. It never would be, but the pattern was there in the dates, and the memos and the production schedules, quiet and steady as a heartbeat. The committee needed the friendly witnesses more than it needed the ones who refused. The ones who refused were useful as examples, but the friendly witnesses were the engine. They gave the whole operation the appearance of genuine discovery. They made it look like investigators finding real things rather than a performance designed to reshape an industry from the inside out. And reshape it they did. The stories that got made in the years that followed were different stories. The sharp edges were gone. The films that asked hard questions about poverty, about race, about the way power actually worked in this country, those films got quieter. The ones that celebrated American strength and American goodness and American certainty got louder. It happened slowly enough that most people watching in the dark of a movie theater never noticed the change. But it was a change. The air in those theaters was different than it had been before. friendly witnesses mostly did not talk about this later. A few of them expressed regret in interviews given decades after the fact, when the regret was safe, and the people they had named were old or gone. Kazan received an honorary Oscar in 1999, and half the room refused to stand. Some of them sat with their hands in their laps and looked at the floor. That silence in that room said something that no one needed to put into words. The machinery had done its work, and the work had lasted a very long time. There was an office in Los Angeles. It had no sign on the door. It had no listing in any government directory. The people who worked there did not wear uniforms. They wore suits. They carried briefcases. They looked like accountants or lawyers, or the kind of men who lunch at quiet restaurants and never raise their voices. This office belonged to the Central Intelligence Agency. Not officially, not on paper, but the people who knew about it knew what it was. And some of them, years later, when they were old and the fear had mostly drained away, sat down and tried to describe what they had seen. A script reader named Helen worked in the industry for 30 years. She started as a secretary at a mid-sized studio in the early 1950s. She typed letters. She filed papers. She made coffee and brought it to men who never thanked her. One afternoon, her boss called her into his office and introduced her to two men she had never seen before. They were polite. They asked her questions about her coworkers. What did they talk about at lunch? Did anyone complain about the government? Did anyone seem angry about the way things were run? She told them she didn't know anything. They thanked her and left. Her boss told her to forget the meeting had happened. She never forgot it. She said later that the strangest part was how ordinary it felt. The two men had the manner of insurance adjusters. Calm, professional, slightly bored, like they had asked these same questions in 100 other offices that week, and they probably had. A director named Paul worked in television during the same years. He was not political. He had never signed a petition or attended a rally. He made westerns and game shows and the occasional variety special. He was good at his job, and he kept his head down. One morning, he arrived at the studio to find a producer he had worked with for years cleaning out his desk. The man would not look at him, would not speak. He was gone by noon. Paul asked around quietly. Nobody would say what had happened. The man's name disappeared from the credits of the show they had made together. It was as if he had never been there at all. Paul said he felt a cold feeling move through him that day. Not fear exactly. Something more like the feeling you get when you realize the ground beneath your feet is not as solid as you thought. He kept working. He kept his mouth shut. He made his westerns and his game shows, and he tried not to think too hard about what he had seen. A woman named Frances had a different kind of story. She was a writer. She had sold 2 scripts in the late 1940s, small pictures, nothing famous. She was working on a 3rd when the blacklist arrived. Her name appeared on a list she never saw. She found out about it when her agent stopped returning her calls. When she finally reached him, he told her simply that he could no longer represent her. He sounded sorry. He also sounded afraid. She spent the next several years trying to understand what had happened. She wrote letters. She made phone calls. She asked questions that nobody would answer. Eventually, a friend told her that her name had been connected to a meeting she had attended years earlier, a meeting about housing rights. She had gone once. She had sat in the back and said nothing. She had left early. That was enough. Frances said the thing that stayed with her was not the anger, though the anger was real, and it lasted a long time. The thing that stayed with her was the feeling of being watched. Not just then, not just during those years, but always after. She said she never fully lost it. She would be sitting in her own kitchen, drinking her morning coffee, and she would feel it. That sense of a presence just outside the window. A pair of eyes in the ordinary air. She eventually wrote under a different name. She sold scripts again. She rebuilt something. But she said the work felt different after that. Like writing in a room with a low ceiling. Like choosing your words not just for the story, but for whoever might be reading over your shoulder. These are the stories that didn't make the newspapers. They didn't make the history books either, not for a long time. They lived in kitchens and quiet conversations and letters that got tucked into drawers. They were the texture of those years. The thing underneath the thing. you only heard if you pressed your ear against them and stayed very still. Now here is where the shape starts to show itself. Not all at once. It never happens all at once. It comes the way a face comes out of fog. First a line, then another. Then suddenly you realize you've been looking at something the whole time and just couldn't see it. The CIA was not born loving Hollywood. In the beginning, the agency was young and uncertain. It was founded in 1947. The same year, the House Un-American Activities Committee started calling names in Washington. Same year. That overlap is not nothing. 2 new machines, built in the same season, learning what they could do. The agency's early officers were mostly lawyers and soldiers, and men from old money families who had gone to the right schools. They understood power. They understood information. But they were still learning how to move through a culture, how to shape what ordinary people believed without ever showing their hands. Then someone looked west. Someone looked at Hollywood and understood something important. Movies were not entertainment. Not only, they were the most powerful teaching tool ever built. A person sitting in a dark theater, watching a story unfold on a screen the size of a house, with music swelling and faces 20 feet tall. That person was open in a way they almost never were in ordinary life. Their guard was down. Their feelings were close to the surface. They were ready to believe. The CIA understood this the way a fisherman understands water. By the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, the agency had begun a program it called psychological strategy. The name sounds dry. The work was not. The idea was simple. You could fight a war with guns. You could also fight a war with stories. Stories that made your side look strong and good. Stories that made the other side look dangerous and wrong. Stories that made ordinary Americans feel proud and safe and certain. Hollywood could make those stories. Hollywood was already making them. The question was whether the right people were in the right rooms when the decisions got made. And so, the agency began placing people quietly, carefully, not in every room, not with any kind of master list that has ever been fully found, but in enough rooms, enough conversations, script meetings and studio lunches and private screenings where a man with the right connections might lean over and say, gently, that a certain ending felt more true to life than another. There was an officer named Cord Mayer. He worked in what the agency called covert action. He was smooth and educated, and he moved through cultural circles the way water moves through sand. He had connections to writers, to editors, to people who shaped what got published and what got seen. He was one of several men like him, men who understood that the most powerful propaganda is the kind that doesn't feel like propaganda at all. It feels like a movie you loved. The films that came out of Hollywood in those years had patterns. You could see them if you watched enough of them in a row. The Soviet Union was always cold and gray in those films, even when the story had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. American soldiers were always decent and clear-eyed. American families lived in bright houses with wide lawns. The people who questioned authority were usually wrong, usually troubled, usually came around by the third act. These were not accidents. Some of them were. Some of them were just the instincts of writers and directors who had absorbed the mood of the country and put it on screen without thinking twice. But some of them were not accidents. Some of them were the result of conversations that happened before the cameras rolled. Suggestions made in the right tone by the right people. The Blacklist and the CIA's cultural program were not the same thing, but they worked together the way two hands work together. The Blacklist cleared out the voices that might complicate the picture. The agency helped fill the space with something cleaner, something more useful. What you were left with was a version of America, not the whole America, not the complicated, arguing, contradicting, beautiful mess of the real thing. A version, simplified, lit well, scored with the right music, and it played in every theater in the country. It played in small towns and big cities. It played on Saturday afternoons when the light outside was gold and the popcorn was warm, and you were young enough to believe everything you saw. That is how you shape a country, not with a single moment, with 1,000 small ones, with the stories people carry home without knowing they were ever given them. Now think cannot see a string from far away. You can see the hand at the top. You can see the puppet at the bottom. But the string itself, that thin line of control running between them, that part disappears if the light is right. That part was never meant to be seen. That is what happened in Hollywood in the late 1940s and through the 1950s. Not all at once. Not in a single meeting where men in dark suits drew up a plan on a chalkboard. It happened slowly, the way a river changes a canyon. Patiently, without announcing itself. The Office of Policy Coordination was one name for it. The Psychological Strategy Board was another. These were real offices, real budgets, real men with real titles who met in real rooms and talked about culture the way a general talks about terrain. They looked at movies the way you look at a map. They saw roads. They saw borders. They saw places where the message could travel and places where it could not. They had learned something during the war. Stories moved people, not speeches, not pamphlets, stories. A film could do what 1,000 flyers dropped from a plane could never do. It could make you feel something. It could make you believe something without ever knowing you had been asked to believe it. So they got to work. The approach was never crude. That is the part worth sitting with for a moment. These were not men who called a studio and said, "Make this film or else." That is not how it worked. What they did was quieter. They cultivated relationships. They attended screenings. They had lunch. They offered notes. They suggested that a certain kind of story might be well received, that a certain kind of character might resonate with audiences, that a certain ending might land better than another. And the studios listened, not always because they were told to. Sometimes because the men doing the suggesting were charming and well connected and seemed to know things. Sometimes because the studios were already nervous after the hearings and wanted to stay on the right side of Washington. Sometimes because the suggestions just made sense to people who had already decided that America was the hero of every story worth telling. The films that came out of this period had a particular look. You might know it without knowing you know it. The skies were wide and blue. The soldiers were clean and brave. The enemy was clear. The threat was always from outside, never from within. Never from the men in the nice offices, never from the system itself. Science fiction became a favorite vessel. A creature from another world could carry a message about foreign ideology without ever saying the word. A small town under threat from something invisible could teach an audience to trust the authorities and report their neighbors without a single line of dialogue that sounded like a lesson. The fear was real. The monster was real. But the monster was always pointing somewhere specific. Documentaries were useful too. Short films that played before the main feature. Films about American factories and American farms and American families sitting down to dinner in warm yellow kitchens. These films had a glow to them, a particular kind of light that made everything look like it was already a memory worth keeping. And then there were the films that never got made. A script about labor organizers that sat in a drawer. A story about a black family in the South that never found a director willing to take it on. A film about poverty in American cities that lost its funding at the last moment for reasons nobody wrote down. The Blacklist had cleared the room of the writers who might have pushed those stories forward. The cultural program had helped fill the room with something else. What you were left with was a kind of consensus, a shared picture of what America was and what it was for. It felt natural because it was everywhere. It felt true because it was all you could see. The strings were there the whole time. Running from the offices in Washington to the studios in Burbank and Culver City. Running through the lunch meetings and the script notes and the quiet suggestions made by men who never appeared in any credits. You would not have seen them. You were not meant to. You were meant to see the puppet, the bright colors, the story with the satisfying ending where the right people won and the wrong people lost. And the world made sense in the way that only a well-made film can make it make sense. The strings held all of that up. They were just very good at staying out of the light. Now think about what got made, not what could have been made, not what the writers had in their drawers and their notebooks and their heads. Think about what actually got made, what got finished, what got a release date and a poster and a theater in every city in the country. In In the years right after the blacklist took hold, something shifted in American film. The shift was not loud. It did not announce itself. But if you watch the movies from that period in a long row, one after another, you start to feel it. The way you feel a change in the air before rain comes. Something in the light, something in the temperature. The films that got made were clean. They were confident. They believed in the system the way a child believes in a parent. The hero was usually a man in a uniform or a suit. The enemy was usually foreign or strange or both. The family at the center of the story lived in a house with a yard. They had problems, but the problems were the kind that got solved by the final reel. Order was restored. The flag was somewhere in the background, just visible enough. These were not bad films. Some of them were beautiful. Some of them are still beloved. That is part of what makes this so hard to look at directly. And then there is the other list, the list of what got buried. A film called Salt of the Earth was finished in 1954. It told the story of a zinc miners' strike in New Mexico. The miners were mostly Mexican American. The women in the story were not background figures. They were the center of it. They organized. They held the line. The film was made by blacklisted filmmakers using blacklisted actors and a crew that knew exactly what they were doing and why. The response was not a bad review. It was something closer to erasure. A congressman named Donald Jackson stood up in the House of Representatives and called the film communist propaganda before it was even finished. The lab that was developing the film footage got pressure to stop. The union that represented projectionists put out a notice discouraging its members from showing it. The woman who played the lead, a Mexican actress named Rosora Revueltas, was detained by immigration officials and deported back to Mexico before filming was complete. Her remaining scenes had to be finished with a double, shot from behind. The film was completed anyway. It was shown in a handful of theaters. Then it mostly disappeared for years. Here is the detail that is hard to explain away. The pressure on Salt of the Earth did not come from one place. It came from many places at once. Congress, the unions, the labs, immigration enforcement. It arrived from different directions at the same moment, like a storm that forms from all sides of the sky at once. No single memo has ever been found connecting all of those moving parts. No one person has ever been named as the one who pulled every string. And yet, every string got pulled. The timing was too clean. The coordination was too precise for all of those separate institutions to move against one small independent film at exactly the same moment, without any visible center, without any written order anyone has ever found, is the kind of thing that should not be possible. Not without something holding it together. Not without a room somewhere where people who did not officially know each other made decisions that were never written down. Salt of the earth eventually came back. Decades later, the Library of Congress selected it for preservation. They called it culturally significant. They called it historically important. The same country that tried to make it vanish decided, years later, to make sure it lasted forever. That is its own kind of strange. But think about the films that did not come back. The scripts that never got finished. The stories that died in a drawer because the person who was going to write them lost their job, or their name, or their nerve. Those are the ones you cannot count. You cannot make a list of what was never made. You cannot screen a film that was never allowed to exist. What you are left with is a shape. The shape of an absence. The outline of something that should have been there and was not. You can see it if you look at the edges of what got made. The places where the picture goes a little too smooth, where the frame holds a little too still, where the world on screen looks a little too much like the world someone in Washington wanted you to believe in. The strings held it all up, and some of what they held up was beautiful, and some of what they held down is still down there, quiet in the dark. Some people hear all of this and they shake their heads, not because they don't care, because they think the explanation is simpler. They say the blacklist was ugly, yes. It was real, yes. But it was not a master plan. It was panic. It was politicians looking for something to be afraid of, and they found it. It was studios protecting their money. It was neighbors turning on neighbors, because that is what fear does to people. No hidden hand, no office in the dark. Just ordinary human weakness moving fast. That argument is not stupid. It deserves a fair hearing. The skeptics point to the chaos. They say a real operation would have been cleaner, more precise. Instead, the blacklist caught people almost at random. It swallowed up writers who had done nothing more than sign a petition in 1938. It left others alone who had done far more. It was inconsistent, sloppy. Real conspiracies, they say, do not work like that. Real conspiracies have a logic. What happened in Hollywood had the logic of a wildfire. It burned what was in its path and skipped what wasn't. They have a point. And then there is this. The men and women who got blacklisted did not disappear. Not all of them. Some of them kept working. They just worked under other names. They called these names fronts. A front was someone who would lend their name to a script they did not write. The real writer would do the work. The front would take the credit. The studio would look the other way. Everyone knew. Nobody said so out loud. Dalton Trumbo was the most famous of them. He was one of the Hollywood 10. He went to prison for refusing to cooperate. And then, when he got out, he kept writing. He wrote under names like Robert Rich and James Landis. He wrote scripts that won awards. He sat in his bathtub with a board across the top and a typewriter on the board, and he worked. He kept working because the work was the only thing he knew how to do. The skeptics love this part of the story. They say, look, the system was porous. The blacklisted writers found a way through. They kept their voices alive. The machine did not win. And if the machine did not win, maybe it was not as organized as people claim. But here is the thing the skeptics cannot quite explain away. Trumbo wrote under other names. He won an Oscar for The Brave One in 1956. The award went to Robert Rich. Robert Rich did not exist. Nobody came to collect it. The Academy handed the award to an empty name. And for years, officially, nobody knew who had really written it. The truth came out slowly, in pieces, over decades. Now think about what that means. One of the best writers in Hollywood, a man who had won awards before, had to erase his own name to keep working. He had to become a ghost. He had to write in secret in a bathtub under a fake name, and then watch someone else's name get called when the work was celebrated. The skeptics say the system was porous, but Trumbo had to disappear to get through the holes. That is not a small thing, and Trumbo was not alone. Carl Foreman wrote High Noon, and then fled to England. Michael Wilson wrote Bridge on the River Kwai, and did not get credit for it until 1996, 39 years after the film came out. Nedrick Young wrote The Defiant Ones under the name Nathan E. Douglas. He won the Oscar. He could not use his real name to accept it. The skeptics say the blacklist was messy and disorganized, but the writers who lived through it had to build entire second identities just to survive. They had to split themselves in two: the person who wrote and the name that got paid, the work and the ghost who did it. That is a strange kind of freedom. The skeptics are right that not every piece fits perfectly. They are right that panic and greed explain a lot. They are right that you do not need a grand design to produce a disaster. Sometimes the disaster assembles itself, but they go quiet when you ask them this. If it was just panic, just chaos, just ordinary fear doing what fear does, then why did it land so hard on the writers? Not the directors first, not the actors first. The writers, the people who decided what stories got told and how they got told and what they meant. Panic does not aim that well. There were people who saw it clearly, not in hindsight, not after the documents came out, not after the historians wrote their books. They saw it while it was happening, and they said so, and it cost them everything they had built. These are the believers, not the conspiracy theorists, not the ones who needed a villain to explain their own failures. The ones who had been inside the room, the ones who had watched the machinery move and recognized what it was. Lillian Hellman was one of them. She was a playwright. She had a sharp tongue and a sharper mind, and she did not suffer fools quietly. When she was called before the committee in 1952, she wrote them a letter. She told them she would not cut her conscience to fit this year's fashions. That line has lived longer than most of the men who tried to break her. She named no names. She lost her work. She lost her income. She kept her name, the real one, and she kept what she knew. What she knew was this: the pressure was not random. It was not a wave that washed over everyone equally. It moved in a direction. It moved toward the people who asked questions, the people who wrote characters that made audiences uncomfortable, the people who put a poor man on screen and let him be right about something. Dalton Trumbo was another one. He was the most successful screenwriter in Hollywood before the blacklist swallowed him. He wrote fast, and he wrote well, and he made a great deal of money doing it. After the blacklist, he wrote in his bathtub. He wrote under other names. He wrote for a fraction of what he had earned. And he talked about what he saw with a kind of tired, clear-eyed certainty that is hard to argue with. He said the blacklist was not about communism. Not really. He said it was about control, about who got to tell the American story and what that story was allowed to say. He had lived on both sides of the line. He knew the difference between the work he did freely and the work he did in hiding. He knew what had been taken and why. The believers were not all famous. Some of them were script readers and story editors and junior writers who never made the front pages. They watched their colleagues disappear. They watched the meetings where names got passed around like playing cards. They watched men they had eaten lunch with for 10 years suddenly pretend not to see them in the street. One woman, a script reader at a major studio in the early 1950s, described it this way. She said it felt like a sickness moving through a building. You could not see it. You could only see what it left behind. Empty desks, locked offices, projects that had been greenlit on a Tuesday and were quietly dead by Friday with no explanation given to anyone. She kept notes. A lot of them kept notes, not because they thought anyone would ever read them, but because writing it down was the only way to hold onto the shape of what was happening. When you are inside something that large and that strange, the details start to blur. The notes kept the details sharp. What the believers share across all their different stories is this quality of calm. They are not angry, or they are not only angry. They are certain. They saw what they saw. They do not need you to believe them. They are past that. The certainty sits in them like a stone at the bottom of a clear river, still heavy, unmoved by the current running over it. That But certainty came at a price. Speaking up, even years later, even after the worst of it had passed, still carried a cost. Hollywood has a long memory for the people who make it uncomfortable. The ones who named names got their careers back quickly. The ones who kept talking about what the naming meant did not always fare as well, but they kept talking. That is the thing about the believers. They could have gone quiet. A lot of people did. A lot of people decided that the smart move was to let it recede into history and not poke at it anymore. The believers decided that the smart move was not the right move. They had watched a town turn on itself. They had watched neighbors become informants and friends become strangers. And the whole warm machinery of a creative community seize up and go cold. They had watched it happen, and they knew what had moved it. And they were not going to pretend otherwise. Not for comfort, not for safety, not for anyone. The studios are still there. You can drive past them on a warm afternoon and see the gates and the guard booths and the long white walls catching the California sun. They look permanent. They look like they were always there and always will be. But the land underneath them has a different story to tell. Los Angeles sits on a dry basin ringed by mountains. The Santa Monica Range runs along the north edge of the city like a spine. The hills above Hollywood are pale and golden in summer, dark green after rain. The soil is thin up there, rocky. It does not hold things easily. What gets buried in that ground has a way of working itself back to the surface over time. The studios knew what was happening. That is the part that sits quietly at the center of all of this. Not the government pressure, not the committee hearings, not the lists of names. Those things were visible. Those things made the papers. The part that nobody talked about was the part the studios understood from the very beginning and chose to accept. The major studios in the late 1940s were not small operations. They were enormous machines. They employed thousands of people. They had legal departments and public relations teams and executives who spent their days reading the political, whether the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm. When the pressure came from Washington, those executives did not need anyone to explain what was being asked of them. They already knew. There were meetings, quiet ones, not the kind that show up in the official record, the kind that happen in a private dining room at a good restaurant or in someone's home in Bel Air, with the right people around the table and no secretaries taking notes. The studio heads met with each other. They agreed on a course of action. And then they went back to their offices and implemented it without ever writing down exactly what they had agreed to do. The Waldorf statement came out of one of those meetings, November 1947. The heads of the major studios gathered at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York and issued a joint declaration. They said they would not employ communists. They said it plainly and publicly. But the statement was only the visible part, the part you could read in the newspaper, the part underneath it, the actual machinery of how the blacklist would work, who would be on it, and how they would be removed, and what it would take to get back in. That part was handled quietly, in rooms that did not make the news. The studios knew which names were on the lists before those names were ever made public. They knew because they had been told directly by people who had access to the same information the government had. The process was not random, and it was not chaotic. It was organized. It moved the way water moves through a landscape, finding the lowest point, following the path of least resistance, carving channels that looked natural but were shaped by something deliberate. The physical places hold that memory in their own way. The old RKO lot on Melrose Avenue is a different studio now. The buildings have been rebuilt and renamed. But the streets around it still run the same way they ran in 1947. The same palm trees line the same blocks. The same dry hills rise up behind the same low buildings. If you stand on the right corner at the right time of day, when the light is going gold and the shadows are getting long, you can feel the weight of what happened there. Not as something frightening, more like the feeling of a room where something important once took place. A quiet heaviness in the air. The ground in Lowe's Angels does not lie still. The whole basin shifts. Faults run under the city like old arguments that never got resolved. Things that were buried come back up. Documents surface. Memos get declassified. Conversations that were never never supposed to be recorded turn out to have been recorded after all. The land gives things back eventually. It just takes time. The studios built their walls high and their gates solid. They made themselves look like fortresses. But a fortress keeps things out and keeps things in. What was kept in those walls during the Blacklist years, the knowledge, the complicity, the quiet agreements made over good wine in private rooms, that knowledge did not disappear when the Blacklist officially ended. It settled into the institution the way water settles into stone. Slow, patient, present, the walls are still white in the afternoon sun. The gates are still there. The guards still wave the right cars through. And underneath all of it, the ground remembers what the official record chose to leave out. Fear does not stay in one place. That is the thing about it. It moves. It passes from room to room the way smoke passes through a house. You close one door and it finds a gap under another. You seal the windows and it comes up through the floor. What happened in Hollywood during those years was not a single event. It was a pattern. And patterns, once you know how to see them, show up everywhere. Go back a little further. Back to the 1930s, before the Blacklist had a name, before the committees had their cameras and their microphones. In New York City, the Federal Theater Project was putting on plays. Real plays. Strange plays. Plays about workers and wages and the gap between the rich and the poor. The audiences filled the seats every night. The tickets were cheap. The writing was sharp. Washington watched. And in 1939, Congress cut the funding. The Federal Theater Project was gone inside of a year. The official reason was cost, but the plays stopped. The voices went quiet, and the stages went dark. The same shape, different city, different decade. Go further west. Go to the universities. In the early 1950s, professors across the country were asked to sign loyalty oaths. A piece of paper, a simple statement. You are not a communist. You have never been a communist. You do not know anyone who is a communist. Some signed without thinking. Some refused on principle. The ones who refused lost their jobs. The ones who signed and were later named by a colleague lost their jobs anyway. The oath did not protect anyone. It only sorted people into those who would comply and those who would not. The universities got quieter. The classrooms got safer. The ideas got smaller, the same shape again. There is a word for this. Scholars who study power call it a chilling effect. You do not have to punish everyone. You only have to punish a few people publicly enough that everyone else changes their behavior on their own. The room gets cold. People pull their coats tighter. Nobody announces that the temperature has dropped. It just has. And everyone in the room adjusts without being told to. That is how fear moves through a room. Think about the radio. In the late 1940s, a publication called Counterattack began printing names. Broadcasters, actors, writers who worked in radio. The list was called Red Channels. It had 151 names in it. It was not a government document. It was a private newsletter, but the networks treated it like law. If your name was in red channels, your phone stopped ringing. Your agent stopped calling back. You did not get fired exactly. You just stopped getting hired. The mechanism was invisible. The result was the same: private pressure, public silence, no fingerprints. This pattern did not begin in America, and it did not end there. But America had its own version of it, shaped by its own geography and its own particular anxieties. A country that big, that loud, that full of competing voices needed something to organize the noise. Fear is very good at organizing noise. Fear makes people self-edit. Fear makes people careful. And careful people do not make art that asks hard questions. Out in the desert states, in the small towns that sat far from any coast, people heard about the blacklist the way they heard about most things from the coasts. Secondhand, through the radio, through the newspaper, through the movies themselves, which kept arriving at the local theater every Friday, scrubbed clean of anything that might cause concern. The movies that reached those towns in the early 1950s were bright and confident. The families on screen were happy. The soldiers were brave. The enemies were clear. The world made sense in the way that only a managed world can make sense. People in those towns did not know what had been removed. You cannot miss what you were never shown. That is the quietest part of the whole story, not the hearings, the named names, not the men who went to prison. The quietest part is the audience sitting in the dark, watching a screen that had been carefully arranged for them, and feeling, without knowing why, that something was slightly off, like a meal that was cooked well, but was missing one ingredient you could not name. The flavor was almost right. Almost. Fear had moved through the room long before they arrived. It had done its work. It had rearranged the furniture. And by the time the lights went down and the picture started, everything looked perfectly normal. That was the point. That was always the point. Some of them left quietly. They packed a single bag, told their neighbors they were visiting family, and did not come back. Their houses sat empty for a while. Then someone else moved in. The mail stopped. The name faded. And after a few years, it was as if they had never been there at all. But they left things behind. Not on purpose, mostly. A box of letters in a storage unit in Burbank. A stack of photographs tucked inside a book donated to a library in Pasadena. A film reel found in the back of a closed-down editing room, still in its canister, still wrapped in paper, labeled with a title nobody recognized. These are the artifacts, the things that survived because nobody thought to destroy them. The things that make the story harder to wave away. Charlie Chaplin left in 1952. He had been under watch for years. The FBI had a file on him that ran to nearly 2,000 pages. 2,000 pages on a man who made people laugh. He sailed to London for a film premiere, and the government revoked his re-entry permit while he was on the water. He never came back to live in America. He settled in Switzerland. He left behind a house in Beverly Hills, a studio on La Brea Avenue, and a body of work that the government spent years trying to quietly discourage. His films were pulled from circulation. His name was spoken carefully, if at all. But the films existed. The reels were real. You could hold one in your hands and feel the weight of it, the cool metal of the canister, the faint chemical smell of old celluloid. Dalton Trumbo left too, in a way. He did not leave the country, but he left his name. He wrote under other names, as we talked about before. But what survived were the drafts, the handwritten pages. The carbon copies with his real name typed at the top and then crossed out, replaced with something invented. Those pages exist in archives now. You can look at them. You can see where the pen struck through the name. That single line through a man's name is a small thing. It is also a record of exactly what was being asked of him. Paul Robeson had his passport taken. He was one of the most famous men in America, a singer and actor whose voice could fill a concert hall without a microphone. The government decided he should not be allowed to travel. They held his passport for 8 years. 8 years. He could not perform abroad. He could not earn a living the way he had built his life to earn it. When he finally got the passport back, he was older, and his health was not what it had been. He left for Europe and spent his last years largely out of the public eye. What survived were his recordings. Vinyl records with his face on the cover, pressed in the 1940s, sitting in used record shops for decades, waiting for someone to pick them up and wonder who he was. The photographs are strange in their own way. There are group pictures from studio parties in the late 1940s, wide shots of crowded rooms, men in suits and women in evening dresses, everyone smiling at the camera. And then you look at the same group a few years later, and someone is missing. Not cropped out, just gone. The space where they stood is now someone else, or just empty air. The party went on. The pictures kept being taken, but the faces changed. There is a letter in the collections at the Writers Guild of America that was written by a screenwriter in 1951. He was writing to a friend who had already left for Europe. The letter is mostly ordinary. He talks about the weather. He mentions a film he saw. Near the end, almost as an aside, he writes that he has been thinking about leaving too. He says the work has changed. He says the rooms feel different now. He says he cannot explain it exactly, only that when he sits down to write, something is watching over his shoulder that was not there before. He never names what it is. He does not have to. That letter is real. You can read it. It is typed on thin paper that has gone slightly yellow at the edges. The ink is faded but legible. The signature at the bottom is clear. He did leave, eventually. He went to Mexico. he wrote a few more scripts under a different name. And then the record of him simply stops, the way records do when a person decides they are done being findable. The artifacts do not explain everything, but they confirm that something happened, something that made people disappear, something that left marks on paper and film and vinyl and thin yellow letters, something real enough to hold in your hands. Generations pass a story the way they pass a quilt. Each hand that holds it leaves a little of itself behind. The colors shift. Some patches fade. New ones get added in places nobody quite remembers. But the shape of the thing stays the same. You can still feel what it was made for. There are families in this country who grew up hearing about the blacklist at the dinner table, not as history, as something that happened to someone they loved. A grandfather who stopped working, an aunt who changed her name, a father who came home one afternoon and never went back to the studio. The story got told in pieces, usually around the holidays, usually late at night when the dishes were done and the kids were supposed to be asleep but weren't. The details changed with each telling. That is how family stories work. The year shifts. The names blur a little. The exact words someone said get smoothed over time until they sound almost like something from a film. But the center holds. Someone was punished for what they believed. Someone lost something they could not get back. And the people who loved them never fully understood why. What is interesting is what those stories left out. Most families did not talk about the bigger picture. They talked about the person. The grandfather, the aunt, the father. They talked about the loss in human terms, which is the only way most people can hold a loss that large. The idea that a government agency might have been shaping the stories their family member was trying to tell. That the movies they watched every Friday night were being quietly steered by people in offices they never saw. That was not part of the dinner table version. That part came later, if it came at all. Because here is the thing about the screen. It does not announce itself. It does not walk into the room and say, "Here is what I want you to feel." It just shows you a picture. It just tells you a story. And the story gets inside you the way water gets into stone, slowly, without force. Until one day the stone is different, and and you cannot say exactly when it changed. The films that came out of Hollywood in the late 1940s and through the 1950s had a particular feeling to them, a kind of brightness that sat just slightly too high. Families were cheerful in a way that felt like a held breath. Communities were safe and orderly and full of people who looked the same and wanted the same things. The world outside those communities was vague and threatening, and best not thought about too hard. You watched those films and you felt something settle in your chest, something warm and a little heavy, something that said, "Stay here. This is enough. This is good." That feeling was not an accident. The writers who might have complicated that picture were gone. The directors who wanted to show something harder and truer were working under other names, or not working at all. The stories that asked difficult questions about who gets to be safe and who does not, about what a community costs and who pays that cost, those stories did not get made, or they got made in fragments, smuggled in under the surface of something that looked ordinary, a western, a thriller, a film about a small town with a secret. Some of those films you have probably seen. You watched them as a child, maybe, or late at night, on a channel that played old movies. You felt something in them that you could not quite name, a weight beneath the brightness, a shadow at the edge of the frame. That was the thing the writers could not fully suppress, even when they were trying to survive. The truth has a way of leaking through. The families who told these stories at the holiday table were passing down more than a grievance. They were passing down a kind of knowledge. The knowledge that the stories you are told are chosen, that someone decided what you should see and what you should not, that the warmth you felt in a dark theater on a Friday night was, at least in part, a thing that had been engineered for you by people who had reasons for wanting you to feel exactly that way. That is a hard thing to hold. Most people set it down after a while. They go back to the film. They let the warmth settle in their chest again. And the screen keeps going, bright and steady, telling you exactly what it was always going to tell you. The families remember, but memory is quiet. The screen is loud, and it never stops. While all of this was happening inside American studios, something else was happening outside them. across the ocean, in countries still rebuilding from the war, filmmakers were making movies that Washington could not control. And that fact alone made certain people very nervous. Italy had its neorealists. Men like Roberto Rossellini and Vittorio De Sica were pointing cameras at rubble and hunger, and ordinary people who had nothing left to pretend with. Their films looked nothing like what was playing in American theaters. No polished sets, no orchestral swells, just faces, just streets, just the weight of surviving. These films moved through audiences like cold water. People watched them and felt something shift. France had its own restless voices. Japan had filmmakers who were quietly asking questions about power and memory that no American studio would have touched. These were not propaganda films in the way Washington used that word. They were something harder to dismiss. They were honest. And honesty, it turned out, was the problem. A film that showed working people as dignified and complex was, in certain offices, considered dangerous, not because it called for revolution, not because it named any enemy, but because it suggested that the world was more complicated than the story America was telling about itself. That was enough. That was more than enough. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was one of the organizations that stepped into this space. It funded art, music, literary magazines, and cultural events across Europe and beyond. It positioned American culture as the free world's answer to Soviet control. The CIA's connection to it did not become public until 1967. For years, it operated quietly, shaping what the educated classes in other countries read and heard and saw. The goal was not to ban foreign films. The goal was to make American films so appealing, so well-funded, so technically dazzling, that the other stories would simply be crowded out. You do not need to silence a voice if you can make it very hard to hear. This is the quieter part of the story, not the blacklist, not the hearings, not the names named in front of cameras. This part has no single dramatic moment. It is a long, slow pressure, the kind that reshapes things without anyone being able to point to the exact moment when the shape changed. Think about what a foreign film offered that an American American studio film often could not. It could show a government as corrupt. It could show a war as pointless. It could show a rich man as the villain without softening the ending. It could leave things unresolved because life leaves things unresolved. These were not radical ideas. They were just honest ones, and they were exactly the kind of honesty that made certain people in Washington reach for a phone. The films that got screened in American art houses during the 1950s were often the ones that slipped through, the ones that had already won prizes in Europe and could not be quietly set aside. But the ones that did not have prizes, the ones that were simply good and true and inconvenient, those found it harder to travel. Distribution is its own kind of power. If a film cannot find a screen, it does not exist for most people. The families who passed down these stories understood this without always being able to say it plainly. They knew that the world was full of stories that never made it to them. They knew that what they saw at the theater was a selection, not a window. Someone had chosen it. Someone had paid for it to be there, and not something else. That knowledge sits differently in the body than fear does. Fear is sharp. This is more like a low hum. The sense that the room you are in is smaller than you were told, that the walls are closer than they look. And yet, the foreign films kept coming. Slowly, unevenly, in small theaters in big cities, in college towns, in the kinds of places where people were willing to read subtitles and sit with discomfort. They kept arriving like letters from somewhere else. Proof that other ways of seeing were possible. That the story did not have to end the way the studio said it would. Washington could not stop all of it. Nobody can stop all of it. Stories find their way. They always have. They move through people the way water moves through stone, not fast, not loud, but steady. And stone, given enough time, gives way. The screen kept going, but other screens were going too. And some of them were showing something different, something that did not need to be engineered, something that was simply, quietly true. There is a moment late at night when Los Angeles stops pretending. The traffic thins. The signs go dark one by one. The hills sit heavy against the sky, black and still, like sleeping animals. The air smells of dry grass and something faintly sweet, jasmine maybe, carried on a warm wind from somewhere you cannot quite name. The city breathes out, and in that exhale, something shifts. Stand on one of those hills tonight. Look down at the basin below. The lights spread out in every direction, orange and white and gold, like embers scattered across a dark floor. It goes on forever, or it feels that way. The sky above is a deep, soft purple, the kind of purple that only lives at the edge of night, just before the stars take over completely. And the stars do take over, out past the glow, past the last streetlight. They come through thick and bright and indifferent to everything that happened down here. This is where it happened, right here, under this same sky. The studios are quiet now. The big lots on Melrose, on Lancashire, on Washington Boulevard. They sit behind their walls and their gates, dark and enormous. Sound stages the size of airplane hangars. Backlot streets built to look like Paris, like New York, like small-town America. All of it empty, all of it waiting. In the daytime, those places hum with light and noise, and the business of making things look real. But at night, they go very still, and the stillness has a weight to it. You can feel it if you stand close enough to the walls. The spell, when it started to break, did not break loudly. That is the thing about spells. They do not shatter. They soften. They thin out at the edges, the way fog thins when the morning comes in off the ocean. You do not see the moment it changes. You only notice, at some point, that you can see further than you could before. It was the late 1950s. The hearings had slowed. The lists were still there, still circulating, still doing their quiet damage. But something in the air had changed. A few names had started to come back. Slowly, carefully, a writer here, a director there. A credit that had been hidden for years, suddenly allowed to surface. Not because anyone in power had decided to be generous, but because the pressure had built up somewhere else. Because the public had started to ask questions. Because some of the men who had done the naming were starting to look smaller than they once had. The night wind moves through the canyon above the city. It comes down through the chaparral, through the scrub oak and the manzanita, past the old houses that cling to the hillsides. It smells of dust and sage. It moves through the open windows of the houses where the writers used to live, the ones who stayed, the ones who came back, the ones who never left even when everything told them to go. Some of them were still writing, under other names, yes, in secret, yes, but writing, because that is what writers do. They cannot stop. The story keeps moving inside them, whether anyone is paying them for it or not. And some of those stories were starting to find their way out into the light again. The basin below you glows on. The city does not sleep, not really. It dims and quiets, but it does not stop. Somewhere down there, in a small apartment, in a house in the hills, someone is at a desk with a lamp on. Someone is writing something. Someone is trying to say something true. That is what the spell could not hold forever. Truth has a way of outlasting the systems built to contain it, not because truth is magic, but because people are stubborn. Because the need to say what you actually saw, what you actually felt, what you actually know, that need does not go away just because someone tells you it is dangerous. The stars above the basin are very old. They were here before the studios, before the hearings, before the lists, before any of it. They will be here long after. They do not care about any of this, not in the way we mean when we say care. But they are steady. They are constant. And on a night like this, standing on a hill above a city that runs on stories, that steadiness feels like something. The spell was breaking, slowly, unevenly, the way all spells break. And the people who had kept writing through the dark were about to step back into the light. It did not happen all at once. That is the first thing to understand. There was no single morning when the doors swung open and everyone walked back in. No ceremony, no trumpet. The names came back the way frost leaves a window in early spring, slowly, in patches, one small clear spot at a time. Dalton Trumbo was one of the first to come back into the light with his real name attached. He had kept writing through the whole dark stretch. He had sold scripts under fake names, under borrowed names, under names that belonged to other people. He had won an Academy Award in 1956 and could not walk up to claim it. The award went to a front, a man holding a name that was not his own. Trumbo stood somewhere else and said nothing. Then came 1960. Kirk Douglas was producing a film called Spartacus, a big picture, a Roman epic about a slave who leads a rebellion against an empire that owns him. Douglas put Trumbo's real name on the screen, right there in the credits. Dalton Trumbo. No hiding, no front, just the name of the man who wrote it. That credit was a small thing. It was also enormous. Otto Preminger did the same thing that same year with Exodus. 2 films, 2 real names. The wall did not fall overnight, but it cracked. And once something cracks, the cold gets in, and the cold does its slow, patient work. The studios did not rush to apologize. That is not how institutions behave. They moved sideways. They allowed things quietly that they had forbidden loudly. Writers who had been untouchable found that phones were ringing again. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but somewhere for some. The people who had been named, who had been called before the cameras and the microphones and the men with their lists. They had lived a decade or more in a kind of half-life. Some had gone to Europe. Some had gone to New York. Some had taken jobs under the table and pretended to be people they were not. They had raised children in houses where you did not talk about certain things, where you did not say certain names, where the past was a room with the door closed. Those children grew up, and they remembered. Some of them became writers themselves. Some became directors. Some became the kind of people who ask questions at the right moment, who pull at threads, who sit in archives with a cup of cold coffee and read through boxes of paper that nobody has touched in 30 years. They carried the story forward, not always loudly, but steadily. By the 1970s, the word blacklist had entered the common language. People used it the way you use a word when you already know what it means, when it needs no explanation. That is a particular kind of power, when a word becomes shorthand for a whole era of fear, for a whole system of control. It means the story has settled into the culture. It means people have decided to remember. Hollywood itself has a complicated relationship with that memory. The town makes movies about the blacklist. gives awards to films about the blacklist. It celebrates the writers who survived it. And at the same time, it is the same town, the same hills, the same offices, the same basic arrangement of power and money, and the people who need both to make anything at all. There is a particular kind of irony in that. The machine that was used against those writers is the same machine that now tells their stories. The studios that handed over names now produce the prestige dramas about the men whose names were handed over. You can decide for yourself what that means. What is clear is this: the people who kept writing through the dark years changed what American stories could say. Not because they were heroes in the storybook sense, but because they refused to stop. They wrote under fake names and real names and no names at all. They wrote in small apartments with the curtains drawn. They wrote in exile, in Europe, in Mexico, in the spare rooms of friends who were willing to take the risk. And the work survived. Some of it came out under the right name eventually. Some of it is still out there with the wrong name on it, sitting in a film archive somewhere, waiting for someone to look closely enough. The names came back slowly. Not all of them, not completely, but enough to matter, enough to remind you that a story, once it exists, is very hard to make disappear entirely. There was a man named Victor Navasky who spent years carrying this story around like a stone in his coat pocket. He wasn't a filmmaker. He wasn't a blacklisted writer. He was a journalist from New York who became obsessed with a simple question: what actually happened? Not the version people agreed to remember. The real version. The one with names and dates, and the specific sound of a door closing behind someone who never came back. He traveled. He made phone calls. He sat across from old men and old women in living rooms that smelled like coffee and old paper. He asked them to remember things they had spent decades trying not to remember. Some of them talked. Some of them didn't. Some of them cried. Some of them got angry. And slowly, over years, a picture formed that was more complicated and more human than the simple story anyone had been telling. His book came out in 1980. It was called Naming Names, and it did exactly what the title said. It It named the people who had cooperated. It named the people who had refused. It laid out the machinery of the whole thing in plain language, the way you'd explain a broken clock to someone who had never seen one before. Here is the gear. Here is where it stopped turning. Here is what that did to everything connected to it. The book landed quietly at first. Then it didn't. People who had been silent for 30 years started talking. Old arguments came back to the surface, like things rising in still water. The industry had to look at itself again, not comfortably. Then came the boxes. The Freedom of Information Act had been passed in 1966, but government files move slowly. Requests pile up. Agencies push back. It takes time for the paper to travel from the locked cabinet to the open table. By the 1990s and into the 2000s, documents started coming out of the CIA and the FBI that confirmed what people had suspected for a long time. The connections were real. The coordination was real. The interest in Hollywood as a tool of influence was not a theory. It was a policy. The documents were dry. They read the way government documents always read, flat and careful, and stripped of anything that sounds like feeling. But if you read them slowly, the shape of the thing became clear. Meetings had happened. Memos had been written. People in suits had sat in rooms and discussed which stories should reach American audiences and which stories should not. They had used the word influence. They had used the word messaging. They had talked about film the way a carpenter talks about wood, as material, as something to be shaped. One researcher who spent years going through these files described the experience as reading the instruction manual for something you had already lived inside. You recognize the machine. You just never knew someone had written it down. The files also confirmed something about the foreign programs. The CIA had funded cultural organizations in Europe. It had supported certain kinds of art and certain kinds of film. Not always directly, not always with a signature on a check, but the money moved, and the money shaped what got made and what got seen. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, which had sponsored exhibitions and publications and films across Europe for years, turned out to have been funded in part by the agency. That came out in 1967. The documents that followed over the decades filled in the details. Some of the people who had participated in those programs said they hadn't known. Some of them probably hadn't. Some of them probably had. The line between genuine belief and useful cooperation is not always easy to find. What the documents gave back, more than anything, was specificity. The blacklist had always felt, to people who came to it later, like something that happened in a fog. A general fear, a general pressure. The files made it concrete. This person, this date, this decision, this consequence. A story that lives in exile, carried from place to place by the people who survived it, tends to blur at the edges over time. It becomes legend. It becomes symbol. It loses the weight of the specific. The documents gave the weight back. They said, this was not a rumor. This was not a feeling. This happened. Here is the paper. Here are the names. Here is the date on the memo. Here is the signature at the bottom of the page. And once you have that, once the thing is written down and confirmed and sitting in an archive under fluorescent lights, it stops being a ghost story. It becomes history, which, in some ways, is harder to carry, but also harder to lose. History tells you what happened. It cannot always tell you what didn't. And that is where this story opens one last door and leaves it standing wide. Think about the films that got made, the ones that played in theaters across the country through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The cheerful ones, the safe ones, the ones where the hero was clean and the ending was certain, and the world made a kind of sense that the real world never quite managed. Those films exist. You can watch them. They are preserved and cataloged and sitting in archives of their own. But there is another archive, one that has no building, no address, no fluorescent lights humming overhead. It is made of the films that were never made, the scripts that sat in desk drawers and went yellow at the edges, the stories that writers carried in their heads for years, waiting for a moment that never came, the ideas that got killed before they reached paper, because the person who had them knew better than to write them down. That archive is enormous. It stretches across decades, and it is, by its nature, almost completely invisible. You cannot catalog a silence. You cannot put a title card on a film that doesn't exist. But sometimes, if you look carefully, you can find the shape of it. There are interviews, old ones recorded late in people's lives when the fear had finally loosened its grip. Writers and directors and actors who talked near the end about the things they had wanted to make. Stories about labor and poverty, and the specific weight of being poor in a rich country. Stories about race that didn't soften the edges. Stories about war that didn't arrive at pride. Stories about ordinary people ground down by systems too large and too indifferent to notice them. Some of those people said, "I tried." Some of them said, "I knew better than to try." Some of them said, "I forgot for a while that I had ever wanted to." That last one is the saddest kind of answer. The forgetting that comes from years of not being allowed to remember. The fog the blacklist created was not just about careers. It was about imagination. When you spend long enough being told that certain thoughts are dangerous, you stop having them. Or you have them quietly, in private, and they never make it out into the world where they might find someone who needed them. That is the open question this story leaves behind. Not just what was suppressed, but what was lost so completely that we don't even know to miss it. There is a particular kind of grief in that. It is not the sharp grief of something taken. It is the slow, soft grief of something that never arrived. A letter that was never written. A door that was never opened. You don't know what was on the other side. You only know the door was there, and now it isn't. American cinema went one way. It is worth sitting quietly with the idea that it could have gone another. The films that shaped how a generation understood love and work and country and sacrifice. Those films were made by a specific group of people, telling specific kinds of stories inside a specific set of pressures. The ones who might have told different stories were gone, or silent, or writing under names that weren't theirs, on projects that weren't theirs, for money that kept them alive but didn't keep them whole. What does a culture look like when you remove a layer of its storytellers? What grows in that space? What doesn't grow? Those are not questions with clean answers. They are the kind of questions that sit with you, the kind that come back on quiet nights when you are half asleep and the world feels older than usual. The documents are real. The names are real. The memos and the signatures and the dates are real. All of that has been confirmed now, pulled out of boxes and read under those fluorescent lights and entered into the record. But the films that were never made are still nowhere. They are still in that invisible archive, still yellow at the edges, still carried in the heads of people who are mostly gone now. History is what happened. The open door is everything else. And somewhere in the distance between those two things, in that wide and quiet space between what was and what might have been, this story lives. Not finished, not closed, just breathing slowly in the dark, the way all the best mysteries do, waiting for someone to wonder about it again. Hollywood still stands. The hills are still there, pale gold in the afternoon light, brown and dry in summer, dark green after the winter rains. The sign still looks down over the city. The studios still hum. The cameras still roll. The lights still go on at night. And somewhere in a screening room, someone is watching something that was made to make them feel a certain way. That part never changed. But the city has a long memory, longer than it lets on. There are streets in Los Angeles where the old buildings still stand. Narrow office buildings with frosted glass doors. Apartment blocks with iron railings and small tiled lobbies. Places where writers used to live, where they used to meet, where they used to argue about what stories were worth telling and why. Those buildings are still there. The paint is different. The names on the mailboxes are different. But the walls remember the weight of all those conversations, the way old walls do. The people who lived through the Blacklist years are mostly gone now. The ones who were young then would be very old today. Some of them told their stories before they left. Some of them wrote memoirs. Some of them gave interviews in their final years, sitting in chairs by windows, speaking slowly, choosing their words with the care of people who had learned what words could cost. They said what they remembered. They said what they believed. And then they were quiet. What they left behind is a kind of unfinished sentence, a story that stops mid-breath. Hollywood does not love this chapter of its history. It acknowledges it the way you acknowledge a scar. You know it is there. You can point to it. You can explain how it happened. But you do not look at it for too long. The industry that was built on the power of story has always been a little uneasy with this particular story. The one where it was not the hero. The one where it bent. The one where it handed over names and kept the cameras rolling and told itself it had no choice. Some years there are films about it. A biopic here, a drama there, an actor playing a blacklisted writer, moving through a world of shadows and closed doors, finding a way to survive. Those films are made with care. They are made with something that looks like guilt and something that looks like pride. The industry giving itself a chance to be brave in retrospect, to stand up for the people it once sat down on. That is not nothing. Memory is not nothing. Even late memory, even imperfect memory. But the deeper question is quieter than any film. It lives underneath the awards and the speeches and the retrospectives. It lives in the space between what the screen shows you and what it is quietly asking you to feel. That question has never fully gone away. Who decides what stories get told? Who decides what feelings are safe to have? Who decides what kind of American you are supposed to be when the lights go down and the picture starts? Those decisions are still being made. They are made in offices, in meetings, in the long, careful conversations between money and art. The names of the people making them are different now. The methods are different. The paperwork looks different. But the basic shape of the thing, the idea that stories are powerful and power wants to shape them, that shape is very old. Older than Hollywood. Older than America. The fire is low now. The night has settled in around you, soft and heavy. The way deep night does when the world has gone quiet and there is nothing left to do but rest. The story has been told. All the names have been spoken. All the documents have been opened. All the shadows have been named as best they can be. And still the hills stand. Still the sign looks down. Still the city glitters below it like a handful of lights thrown against the dark. Somewhere out there, a projector is running. Somewhere, a story is moving across a screen. Somewhere, someone is watching and feeling something and not quite quite knowing why. That is the oldest mystery of all, not the memos, not the lists, not the names. The mystery is the feeling itself, where it comes from, who put it there, whether it was always yours or whether someone handed it to you a long time ago in a dark room before you knew to ask. The hills are quiet now. The city breathes. The stars are out above the sign, cold and clear and very far away. Subscribe for a brand new mystery every night. One tap and a new story is waiting for you tomorrow. Sleep well.